His name was Tommy Reyes, and he was 19 years old, and he had been working at Sunset Sound for 6 weeks. His job in the formal sense was to do the things that nobody else had been assigned to do, to run tapes from the control room to the vault, to bring food from the deli around the corner when sessions ran past midnight, to make coffee in the specific way that specific producers required their coffee made, to be available and capable and unobtrusive in the way that good assistants in recording studios learn to be. He had not been hired because he had connections or a resume. He had been hired because he had shown up every day for 3 weeks asking if there was anything he could do, and eventually there had been. He had been in the building for the Pearl sessions, not in the room, not in Studio 2 where Paul Rothchild and the engineers and Janis Joplin and the Full Tilt Boogie Band were making the record. He had been in the corridors, in the kitchen, in the vault, in the coffee machine alcove, in the peripheral spaces of a recording studio during a major session, which meant he had heard things. Not the finished takes, not the versions that would be on the record. The ambient sound of the sessions, the music that leaked through walls and under doors and around corners in the way that sound in buildings does, finding its way through the spaces that the architecture had not fully sealed. The sessions had been running since June. The material they were recording, songs that would become Me and Bobby McGee, Cry Baby, Move Over, Get It While You Can, had a quality that was audible even through walls, even at the volume that leaked rather than projected, even in the fragments and portions that were all. He was able to receive from his position outside the room. He had heard enough fragments to understand what the fragments were fragments of. He had heard the voice doing something that voices in recording studios, in his 6 weeks of being adjacent to many sessions, had not done before. He had heard enough. He had heard enough to know, in the way that 19-year-olds who have recently discovered music know things with a certainty that is not yet complicated by experience, that what was happening in Studio 2 was something he would not be in the vicinity of again. Not in those specific terms, not that combination of voice and material and configuration and the particular quality that Paul Rothchild, in the conversations Tommy had overheard in the corridors, kept describing with a word that Tommy was adding to his vocabulary, arrived. He said it about specific takes, he said it about specific moments in specific songs. He said it the way you say a word when you finally found the right one and it fits exactly, arrived. The sessions had finished 2 days ago. Tommy had watched the engineers and musicians leave, had watched Rothchild leave with the tape boxes, had watched the studio return to the neutral state that studios return to when a session is over. The equipment returned to standby, the booth cleaned, the ordinary institutional quiet of a building that has been doing something extraordinary and is now simply a building again. He had watched John Till and Brad Campbell and Clark Pearson leave with the specific quality of musicians at the end of a significant project. Tired, accomplished, the particular combination of depletion and satisfaction that comes from doing difficult work well over an extended period. He had not seen Janis Joplin leave. He had seen her arrive and had seen her most days of the sessions, coming and going through the corridor he worked adjacent to, in the specific state of a person who is in the middle of something important and knows it. Not self-important, that was not the right word, he would think later, trying to describe it. Inhabited. Like someone who was occupying the work completely, who was inside it rather than observing it, who had no peripheral attention available for anything outside the thing she was making, because the thing she was making was requiring all of it. On the morning 2 days after the last session, he had come in early, earlier than his shift required, for no reason he could entirely justify, and had found her on the bench outside the building. The bench was a concrete bench. This was the relevant fact about it, the fact that made it the kind of bench that nobody chose when there were other options, the specific aesthetic of a utility bench, functional rather than comfortable, the kind of seating that gets placed outside commercial buildings by people whose primary concern is that something exists there rather than that it be pleasant to use. It was on the north side of the building, in the strip of space between the Sunset Sound exterior wall and the parking lot. There was a small tree nearby that provided, in the summer, a partial shade that the February version of the bench would not have offered. In September in Los Angeles, the shade was modest and the sun was present but not aggressive. the specific quality of a Southern California September morning that is warm without demanding. She was sitting on it with her legs stretched out in front of her and her arms crossed loosely over her chest and her face turned up toward the sky. Her eyes were open. She was not looking at anything in the sky specifically, no cloud, no bird, no particular point, but at the sky itself, in the way that people look at the sky when they need something large and indifferent to look at. The specific quality of that looking was something he noticed even from across the parking lot. It was not the looking of someone who was waiting for something, who was checking a watch, who was expecting a car, who was in the transitional state of someone between one obligation and the next. It was the looking of someone who had arrived somewhere and had no immediate intention of leaving, who had found on a concrete utility bench on the north side of a recording studio in Los Angeles the specific rest state that the past several months had not otherwise made available. She had made something, she had finished making it, and now she was sitting on a bench looking at the sky, and the sky was doing what it always did, which was being there, and she was doing what she rarely got to do, which was nothing. Tommy came around the corner of the building and stopped. He had not expected anyone to be there. The bench was not a place where people typically sat. It was a place where people sometimes stood while waiting for cars, a transitional location rather than a destination. Nobody sat on the concrete bench and looked at the sky except, apparently, on this particular September morning, the person who had just finished recording what Tommy Reyes had heard enough of through walls and under doors to know was something he would not be in the vicinity of again. He stood at the corner of the building for a moment. He had the piece of paper in his jacket pocket. He had been carrying it for 4 days, since the second day of the final recording week, when he had decided, with the specific earnestness of a 19-year-old who has recently discovered that things can matter, that he wanted something from these sessions that he could keep. He had found a clean piece of paper in the supply room, and he had carried it in his pocket and had looked for the right moment and had not found the right moment, because there was no right moment during a recording session for a 19-year-old production assistant to ask the primary artist to sign something. But the sessions were over now. He stood at the corner of the building. She had not seen him. She was still looking at the sky, her face turned upward, her expression the expression of someone who is not doing anything specific but is doing it completely, present in the specific way of someone who has finished something large and is in the particular rest state that follows the finishing of something large, when the body and mind are not yet sure what to do with the space that the large thing has vacated. He could have gone around the other way. He could have taken the longer route to the entrance and avoided this entirely and come back another day, a better day, a day when the timing was less complicated. He went around the corner instead. She saw him when he was about 15 feet away, his footsteps on the pavement announcing him before she turned her head, the specific sound of someone approaching on a surface that communicates footsteps clearly. She looked at him. The expression on her face did not change. It remained whatever it had been, which was not a performing expression or a public expression, but the expression she had been wearing while looking at the sky, which was private in the specific way of expressions that belong to moments before an audience has arrived. She said, "Hey," he said, "Hey," and then, because the social situation required that he identify himself and what he wanted before the silence became its own statement, "I'm sorry to interrupt, I work here." "I'm Tommy," she said, "I know who you are." This surprised him. He had assumed invisibility, had been operating on the assumption that the people in the studio during the Pearl sessions had not been registering the peripheral personnel, the corridor figures, the coffee and tape runners. The assumption was apparently wrong. He said, "I didn't know if you'd..." "Yeah, hi." She waited. She had the quality, in this specific moment on the concrete bench, of someone who had a lot of time and was not in a hurry for anything, which was unusual for a person in the middle of a major touring year with an album about to be released and the specific velocity of a career at that level creating its constant forward pressure. The bench and the September morning and the sky she had been looking at seemed to have temporarily suspended the velocity. He took the piece of paper out of his jacket pocket. He held it out to her. He said, "I know this is, I just wanted, if you'd be willing to sign this." He had not written anything on the paper. He had left it blank, which was either charming or slightly odd, and he was not sure which. A blank piece of paper was not the same as a record sleeve or a photograph. It had no pre-existing content for the signature to respond to, no image or text that the signature would Become part of, it was simply a piece of paper, white and unadorned, waiting to be whatever the signature made it. She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She took the paper and she took the pen he held out with it and she signed her name, Janis Joplin. The specific signature he had seen on contracts and documents in the studio files, large, slightly pressured, the J and the specific quality of a person who wrote their own name the way they wrote everything, with more force than necessary, as if the name itself required conviction to put down. She handed the paper back. He took it. He said thank you in the way of someone who means it more than the words can carry. She nodded, and then he did not leave, and she did not ask him to. He stood there for a moment. The situation had resolved itself. The errand was done. The paper was signed. The social interaction had completed its formal requirement. He could leave. He could say something final and go around the corner and into the building and do whatever his shift required. He did not leave. She was looking at the paper, not at him. At the paper he was holding, the piece of paper she had just signed, which was now in his hands rather than hers, which she could see from where she was sitting, and which she was looking at with an expression that was slightly different from the expression she had been wearing when she looked at the sky. Still private, but considering something, he noticed the looking. He was 19 and somewhat nervous, and was registering everything about the situation with the heightened awareness of someone who understands they are in the presence of something unusual, but he noticed the looking. He held the paper so it was easier to see. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not the kind of question that contains its own answer or that is really a comment in question form. She actually wanted to know. He said, "I don't know, keep it, I guess. I wanted something from the sessions, something I could hold." She looked at him. He was aware, under the looking, of his own 19-year-oldness, the specific transparency of being young in front of someone who is not young in the same way, whose experience has given them the ability to read a person in a way that the person cannot read themselves. She said, "You heard it, didn't you?" "Some of it," he said, "through the walls." "I didn't," she said. "No, I know. Through the walls." She said it without judgment, with the simple acknowledgement of someone who understands that the architecture of a recording studio is not perfectly sealed, and that the people in the peripheral spaces of a major session hear things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that he would not repeat to anyone for many years, that he would carry privately for a long time before finding an occasion and a context and the courage to say it out loud. She said, "I think it's the best thing I've ever made," not as a boast. Not with the specific pride of someone seeking confirmation of what they already believe. With the quality of someone making a precise observation about something they have been close to for a long time, the specific honesty of an artist who has made enough work to be able to distinguish between the levels, who can look at what they have just done and locate it accurately in the map of everything they have done before. He said, "I believe that." She looked at him. Her expression shifted slightly, the private quality of it remaining, but something else arriving alongside it. Something that might have been in a 27-year-old woman who had been performing for 9 years and had recently finished the most fully realized work of her life, the specific gratitude of being believed by someone who had no reason to say it except that it was true. She said, "Good." She turned back toward the sky. He stood there for another moment, the paper in his hand, the September morning around them, the studio building behind him with the neutral hum of a building doing nothing specific, returned to its ordinary state. Then he said goodbye. She said goodbye. He went around the corner and into the building and did his shift and did not tell anyone about the bench or the paper or what she had said. The paper had her name on it and nothing else. He kept it for many years in a drawer that held the specific category of objects that don't have an obvious home, the objects that are neither decorative nor functional, that exist as objects because something about them requires preservation even though the preservation produces nothing concrete. Ticket stubs, photographs of people you have seen perform. Letters that are not important enough to file but too important to throw away. The accumulated archive of being a person who has been in the vicinity of things that mattered. The paper was in this drawer, Janis Joplin's name in the large, slightly pressured handwriting on a blank piece of paper from the Sunset Sound Supply room. Nothing else. He thought about the session sometimes in the way you think about things you were peripheral to that turned out to be more significant than the peripheral position suggested. He thought about the ambient music he had heard through the walls and under the doors, the specific quality of what had leaked through the building's imperfect ceiling on the days the Pearl sessions were recorded. He thought about what Paul Rothchild had meant when he kept using the word arrived. He thought about the bench, the September morning, the sky she had been looking at. The specific expression on her face when she said, "I think it's the best thing I've ever made." He thought about the particular quality of that sentence, the precision of it, the absence of any qualifier or hedge, the artist speaking about her own work with the specific directness of someone who had been making work for long enough to know. He had heard many people say things about their work in the 6 weeks he had been at Sunset Sound. He had heard them through walls and in corridors, in the professional language of producers and engineers and musicians assessing what they had made and what it required. He had heard confidence and doubt and the specific vocabulary of people who worked in a specific technical field and had their own ways of describing what they heard. He had not heard anything like that sentence, not because of what it claimed. Because of how it was said, the tone, the quality of certainty, the specific kind of knowing that was in the saying of it. The knowing of someone who had just finished something and could see it from the outside and could place it accurately in relation to everything that had come before. She had been right. When the album came out in January 1971, 4 months after the September morning, more than 3 months after she had died in a Los Angeles hotel room on October 4th, at the age of 27, the people who heard it said what people said about Pearl, which was a version of what she had said on the bench, that it was the best thing, that it was the arrived thing. That whatever she had been moving toward for 9 years had arrived in those recordings at Sunset Sound in the summer and fall of 1970, and that the arrival was complete and permanent and exactly what it was supposed to be. The critics wrote about the voice, they wrote about the material, they wrote about the production, about Rothchild's specific achievement in capturing what was in the room without diminishing it. They wrote about the specific songs and what made them work, and what the album as a whole said about what she had been building toward and how far she had gotten. They used many words. None of them used the specific sentence she had said on the bench, but the sentence was there, underneath the reviews and the descriptions and the critical vocabulary. It was the sentence that all the other sentences were trying to arrive at. "I think it's the best thing I've ever made," said on a bench to a 19-year-old, 2 days after it was finished, in September sun, looking at the sky. Tommy Reyes was 20 years old when the album came out. He heard it in an apartment in Los Angeles with other people who had not been at Sunset Sound, who had not heard the sessions through the walls, who were hearing it for the first time. He listened to the album from beginning to end. He listened to Mercedes-Benz, the last track, which ran 51 seconds and ended with her laughing and then with silence. He went home. He opened the drawer. He took out the piece of paper. He looked at her name on it for a long time. She had said she thought it was the best thing she had ever made. She had said it on a concrete bench outside a recording studio to a 19-year-old production assistant who had asked for her autograph and stayed longer than he'd planned in the September sun 2 days after the sessions ended. He had said, "I believe that." She had said, "Good." He folded the paper carefully. He put it back in the drawer. He carried it for the rest of his life. And the album went out into the world and found the people who needed it. And those people carried it for the rest of their lives too, in the specific way that music carries, not in drawers, not on paper, but somewhere below the level of storage, in the place where the things that arrived completely are kept accessible forever, unchanging, exactly what they were the first time they were heard. Arrived, that was the word, and it was right.